I call the committee to order for the last time for 2024, and it's good to see our three witnesses before us this morning as we look at flooding in Wales in recent times. And I want to thank the three gentlemen in front of us for coming to see us in person, really helpful. My name is Ruth Jones. I'm a Member of Parliament for Newport West and Islwyn. I'm also Chair of the Welsh Affairs Select Committee. So thank you for coming in this morning. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and state briefly who you are. We'll start with Mr Turner.
Good morning, Bore Da. Russell Turner. I'm head of the Joint Met Office Environment Agency Flood Forecasting Centre based at the Met Office HQ down in Exeter.
Good morning, Chair and Committee. Simon Brown, Director of Services at the Met Office.
I'm Jeremy Parr. I'm the Head of Flood and Incident Risk Management at Natural Resources Wales.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Right, if I may begin. I suppose the first question we wanted to ask you was, obviously we had Storm Bert and Storm Dara in very close succession. They appear to have been treated quite differently within Wales, and I'm just wondering, were the warnings that were issued for Storm Bert adequate to allow people to protect themselves? If I asked maybe Mr Brown and then Mr Parr first. So Mr Brown.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So let me just extend my sympathies to those families whose people were killed in Bert and Dara. Like, weather is impactful, and the Met Office's job is to help people stay safe. Hence why we issue national severe weather warnings. And clearly, there are people's homes have been flooded, both during Bert and Dara, and I recognise it's a really difficult time of the year for people leading up to Christmas. So that kind of just want to reflect that on behalf of the Met Office and myself. We issue national severe weather warnings when there is likely to be impactful weather. That is based on a likelihood and impact matrix. We work closely with our partners around assessing that impacts, and particularly in the case of rain, that will be the Flood Forecasting Centre and Natural Resource Wales, but in other cases we might be working with aviation, transport network, particularly in the case of things like wind and snow and other impacts across transport infrastructure. So we work with a range of partners to try and assess the impacts. For Storm Bert, we had a 2-week period of relatively dry weather, which generally meant soil conditions had dried out. And actually, when we did the impact assessment on Storm Bert, meteorologically there was a lot of rain, but actually the antecedent soil conditions suggested there wasn't going to be as much flooding through our work with FFC, Flood Forecasting Centre, and NRW. Dara was very different. We'd clearly had a very wet period leading up to Dara. It's also a different type of weather system, predominantly more wind than Bert, so all sites across Wales had more than 50 knots, all our observations network. So we had a kind of multi-hazard approach on both Bert and Dara, but Dara was very much focused on wind with pockets of rain warnings, so hence why they were different, very much around what led up to Bert was a much drier period, followed by, between Bert and Dara, a very wet period.
Thank you. Mr Parr, I suppose the question is, were the warnings adequate for Storm Bert? Because obviously we had a lot of damage and flooding from Bert, and people felt that they weren't prepared for that. So do you think the warnings were adequate?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there was a lot of extensive damage as a result of Storm Bert, with over 700 properties flooded across large parts of South Wales. We work really closely with the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre to look at the possibility, the probability of flooding. So we work really closely with the Met Office on the rainfall, and it's important that we give the signal to partner organisations. In advance, we were seeing the signals of these significant events, but with Storm Bert, there was quite a bit of uncertainty, low confidence in the forecast, and that can happen. It's a complicated thing to the weather systems and the weather patterns. It goes to partner organisations, and we take the data and then run that through our models to see what will happen. On the Saturday of Storm Bert, for example, we issued flood alerts across large parts of Wales, and particularly South Wales, to say flooding is possible. People need to be aware. They need to take action. In Storm Bert, there was rapid escalation. It's true to say on that Saturday. Hit some of the steep-sided catchments and valleys like the Taff catchment, for example. Circumstances. Likewise with Storm Dara, again the predictions 5 days out that we were looking at a a storm event. And again, we got the messages out to partner organisations and to the public and across the media as well.
Okay. To Mr. Turner, maybe, what lessons did your organisation learn from the 2020 excuse me, storms, and how did that affect the way you put out warnings for Storm Bert?
Okay, there were a couple of key things from the Storm Dennis period, including working together on Common Warnings Framework, which is underway, which is across all of the partners to look at how the range of warnings from the weather side to what we provide in the Flood Forecasting Centre to the hydrological agencies as well. That work's ongoing, but behind that there was further work done on improving the flood forecasting capabilities. So one area particularly was looking for severe events on a routine basis. So we run 24/7, we have shift working, and our role is to join up the weather forecasting with the flood modelling and the flood forecasting that goes out to responders. We tested that more thoroughly. So one of the learning from Storm Dennis was looking for those severe events. We run a range of national flood models, and they were giving us the good lead time that Jeremy was describing, but we had that in place 4 days in advance. We were also then providing input into Wales, their forecasting centre in Cardiff, to run the local models. And we were testing that with further rainfall. So we were taking the rainfall forecast, but we're also stress testing that as well. So that's a key bit of learning from Dennis. We put 20% more rainfall down, and we still couldn't see an escalation point in the flood risk matrix in the likelihood, nor the impact side into severes. So that's where we could have seen potentially a more severe event with flood defences overtopping, rapid inundation of urban areas on a widespread, much wider scale, tens of thousands of properties. So that for me is a key bit of learning that we have looked at. We are looking for severe events, but in this case, there wasn't a signal. There was until really the observations were coming in on the Sunday morning. But we did test that thoroughly from a national and local level with more rainfall. But we were in a position where we were escalating quickly on the Sunday morning.
Okay. I'm going to hand you over to Afra Brandreth, please.
Oh, thank you. I think it would just be helpful to understand a bit more about the weather warning levels. And Simon, perhaps for you, for those who might not be familiar with the different levels of weather warnings, can you set out what a yellow weather warning actually means, and how did you come to the decision to issue one for Storm Bert?
Thank you for the question. Back after the 1987 storm, we introduced threshold-based warnings, which generally means 80 mils worth of rain or a wind speed of 60 knots might have equated to a yellow or amber warning. Back in 2011, we took a different approach, was moving to an impact base. So this is trying to join up the weather with the potential impacts. And as I described in my first answer, then working with partners around actually what's the impact on the flooding models, what's the impact on aviation, what's the impact on transport. And actually that's recognised as international best practice, and the Met Office is recognised across the international community as adopting a well-regarded best practice around weather warnings. And how that matrix works is we look at likelihood, and likelihood is both around our certainty over the weather forecast, but also what our partners are saying in terms of their certainty, for example, the flood models, and the potential impact we've seen. And that's typically unlikely to very high category. And that you can, if you're a member of the public, you can go and look at that matrix via our app. If you're a member of the response community, you can see that matrix through our hazard management system. For a yellow warning, you can have low impacts but highly likely, which would constitute a weather warning, but you can have for yellow warnings medium or even high impacts. So just to bring that alive, thunderstorms are notoriously difficult to forecast. We know the energy in the atmosphere is going to happen somewhere across the UK, and often we have widespread yellow warnings, and my best analogy for it is like boiling a pan of water. You don't quite know where the bubbles are going to pop up on thunderstorms, so thunderstorms will likely be quite high impact in terms of surface water, but in your local area it's going to be low likelihood because actually the thunderstorm can happen 5 miles away. Whereas other rainfall events we might have more certainty on, so more of a high likelihood but lower impacts. It might be low level localised flooding. So that's kind of how yellow works. Amber warnings are very much about much more significant risk, disruption to transport, disruption to power supplies, really asking the public to really take action and consider consider what they do. And then, of course, red alert, and we issued a red alert for Dara, and particularly in the case of wind, was really stay at home. Protect your property, protect lives. So we do have an escalation route. We don't issue weather warnings lightly, so everyday weather we don't issue weather warnings for. We issue about 400 to 500 a year, and typically less than 40 of them are ambers, and since 2011 we've only issued 16 red warnings.
Thank you. And in hindsight, given the impact from Storm Bert, do you think that the yellow warning was the appropriate one to give?
So, in terms of preparedness, our message is really clear, along with our partners, around significant localised flooding was possible. I think we did see that, and it was fairly widespread. I've noticed the criticisms we received of that. What I would say, this isn't just about the warning system. This is also about the responder community and what local communities do in terms of taking action. Having been in a Welsh Government meeting 2 weeks ago, I generally felt the impacts from that meeting were well understood by the responder community. They were well prepared to respond, and the local councillor for Rhondda Current Taff actually said they prepared like it was an amber. So the impacts were well understood. People had understood our narrative. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and we will certainly look at whether that weather warning was appropriate, and one of the things we are looking at is we always align with our partners. And that's really important to do, because if you're inconsistent in the weather warnings and the flood warnings, responders and the public will get confused. And they will get warning fatigue, but one of the things we are going to look at is, are there rare occasions, because of the volume of rainfall, we step outside our National Severe Weather Warning Practice Guide. But we are going to look at that, but we will not do that lightly, and we'll do it in conjunction with our partners.
Steve Witherden, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question's also for Mr Brown. So Storm Dara and Storm Bert, caused really severe consequences in my constituency. Probably the worst incident was a horrendous landslide that we had in Llanarmon, Dyffryn, Ceiriog during Storm Bert. So can you explain why you issued a yellow warning for Storm Bert, but then a red warning for Storm Dara?
So in terms of general landslips, the Met Office don't have a remit around coal tips. We work with partners such as the British Geological Survey, and if they provide information to us that there is a risk, we will include that within our warning narrative. We have briefed previous First Minister in Wales around, as part of the coal tip safety report in 2022, and the impacts of landslips as a consequence of climate change. So we work with our partners. One thing we do at the Met Office is disseminate into the responder community a daily hazard assessment, but the information on landslips is provided by the British Geological Survey organisation. The clear difference in Bert to Dara red was for wind. So high risk wind, danger to life. As I said earlier, all observation sites in Wales were over 50 knots, and particularly on those coastal areas where you get coastal surges and significant impacts along the coastal. So very different weather situation, whereas Bert was much more rain, whereas Dara was much more wind.
Was the response to Storm Dara informed in any way by the criticism received with the response to Storm Bert?
Simple as that, isn't it? We treat every event the same. Clearly, the difference, as I explained, was that the antecedent soil conditions were much wetter leading up to Dara, so that was the key difference.
One more question, please, Chair, also for Mr Brown. We rightly place huge emphasis on danger to life when deciding the severity of weather warnings. But should we also place an emphasis on danger to livelihood? Both storms have done tremendous damage to people's livelihoods, and I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
So we take into factor disruption to society, not just lives, disruption to businesses, disruptions to homes, disruption to the public, disruption to the business. The National Severe Weather Warning Service is for public, responders, business and government. So we take that all into account, including when we issue severe weather warnings and there's transport routes disrupted, etc. for every pound invested in the Met Office, we've just done a recent London Economic Survey, and the UK economy gets £19 back in return. So the Met Office is very much focused on not just saving lives, but the work it does to drive the economics of the UK.
Thank you. Thank you.
Andrew Ranger, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. This is for Mr. Parr, if I may. Just really for clarity, what is the purpose of two organisations, yourselves and the Met Office, both issuing weather warnings during severe weather? So I think in the previous answer, Mr. Brown mentioned warning fatigue. So it would be good to understand what the purpose of all these warnings is going out.
Yeah, so we work really closely with the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre, and we all do slightly different roles, but part of that chain from the weather through to flooding. So the Met Office's role is to do the weather forecast. Everybody's familiar with that, understanding where the rain is going to fall. So the Met Office issue the weather warnings. NRW doesn't issue weather warnings. We take the information from the Met Office and we work with the Flood Forecasting Centre to look at what that would mean on a Wales basis and on an England and Wales basis actually, county by county in terms of the flood risk. And then NRW itself then looks at the impact on a more local scale using our network of models and rain gauges and river gauges to take the data and look at what it will mean in terms of flooding and the risk of flooding. And we issue flood warnings. So the Met Office issue the weather warnings, we issue the flood warnings. And during those storms we issued a large number of flood warnings across large parts of Wales. And the messaging around flood warnings is important, and that consistency of messaging is important. So a flood alert, which is the lowest level, means flooding is possible. And a lot of the time people think, oh, it's possible, probably won't happen to me. And I think there's something here for us all to continue to work out, and we work really hard at this at the moment in terms of getting that message across that it is possible, and you do need to think about it. It's not a pleasant thing to think about, but a lot of the time people don't think it will happen to them, or indeed are travelling or on vacation in areas at flood risk and might not realise that those areas are at flood risk. So it's important that we get those messages across to people about it is possible, and we did that both in Storm Bert and Storm Darragh. And then the next level is flood warnings, when we're saying flooding is expected. And we all know the sort of unpredictability of the weather and what can happen. So we spend a lot of technological input in terms of the accuracy of those warnings, but also the human input in terms of what the catchments are like. And we are really conscious of not crying wolf too often and losing the message. So it would be really easy to have a lower threshold for issuing warnings, for example, but with a lot less certainty. And there's a real danger there that people say, well, it didn't happen, so therefore I don't really trust it for next time around. We really need to work really hard in that space with communities, with politicians, with community leaders in local authorities to say, no, you need to think about it, you need to think it might happen. And we all know that when it does happen, that the speed at which it can happen is incredible, especially now with more and more extreme weather events. So one of the things that we really encourage for people to do is have that conversation in your house, at home. What would we do if it were to happen to us? Where would we go to? What property would we move? Should we move our car in advance? What about those valuable things? All of those things people need to think about in advance. And that's some of the purpose of the alerts going out and then the warnings going out. And then in extreme circumstances, the severe flood warnings going out. So that whole bit about behaviour change and acceptance of the risk and acceptance of the risk increasing in the future is a really big area for all organisations, local authorities too, to work on.
Thank you. Do you think on the flood warning side, are we reaching all the people we need to? Because obviously, we all see the weather forecasts on television and on our apps and things like that, and so they're quite high profile. But is there, how would you evaluate the systems that actually, from the flood warning side, and are reaching the people that they need to, and linking to what you just said about awareness?
Yes. I mean, so 1 in 7 properties across Wales are at flood risk, but if you ask people, they might not know that. So one of the things that we really encourage with our flood mapping products, first of all, is there's a simple thing on our website where you can put in your postcode and you can find out whether you're at risk or not. And that's often the first point. People think, oh, it's not happened to me before, it's not going to happen to me ever, but it could. It very much could. And then I think there is a free flood warning system service, so people can get the free flood warnings to their home, email or text, but the take-up of that isn't as high as we want it to be. So, for example, in communities in the TAF, the take-up is 36% in certain communities. which are people who are at flood risk and people actually who have flooded before. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it so low? Why isn't it higher? And I think some of the reasons for that is because people are worried about impact on insurance, possibly. They're worried about false positives and getting alarms in the middle of the night. And I think there's also that element of denial within it. And I think we also have to accept that that's a traditional way, if you like, of people getting the messages through the text, through to their home mobile. A lot of people look at our website, for example, and we point people to our website, and we had 1.6 million hits on our website during the course of the last year where people are checking for flood warning. So we need to be responsive to all of these different ways in which people could get flood alerts. I think including potentially working with big tech companies and Google alerts and elements like that. And the emergency alert service, which actually was utilised in Wales for Storm Darragh, is an important part of that messaging in severe circumstances. So there's a whole thing there about recognition of the risk and taking a degree of ownership for it. Public organisations are there to serve, but people also need to take some personal ownership of it. It's not a pleasant or easy thing to say, but it's the reality. What I'm not saying there is they need to sort it out themselves. That's totally what. But they need to recognise that the risk is there, is the point that I'm making.
And do you think on that line, should we explore something along, whether it's through media or something, a higher profile for flood warnings through media?
Yeah, we worked really hard with the media, and we did a lot of media interviews on BBC Wales, ITV, Channel 4, all sorts of media outlets to get the messages out in advance. I think there's always more to do, and I think that area of really working with communities on a grassroots level in terms of getting communities to look out for each other, look out for their neighbours, which they do naturally, in a lot of these communities, but in terms of that flood risk and thinking about who is more vulnerable in the community and how they can help. And I think there's a sort of horrible end to it as well, isn't it? Unfortunately, when you do get that knock on the door and the emergency services are saying leave, you will need to leave, and you will need to leave quite quickly. And I think it's getting people to understand that whole thing. It's a bit like checking into a hotel and there probably won't, an analogy here, probably won't be a fire, but there could be. And would you know how to get out of that hotel? Would you know where the emergency exits are? It's that sort of thinking and that sort of mentality that we want to get. But I stress the public organisations will always be there to support.
Great, thank you very much. Move straight on to the next question.
And can I make a plea for brevity for answers, please?
This one is to Mr Turner, if I may. Does Wales experience more severe flooding than the rest of the UK? And if so, why?
Well, the Flood Forecasting Centre covers England and Wales, so I can only really comment on that part of it. I've been involved in flood forecasting for 15 years, and it is relentless. I would describe it as we have a series of events. Talking about Storm Dennis, we've had 5 years which have been extremely busy. I would say a lot of parts of the UK probably feel similar, and certainly England and Wales. And think back to recent events across Cumbria and Lancashire, for example. Different parts of the UK are probably quite familiar with flood risk. It's difficult to benchmark exactly, but I think these are increasingly likely events and familiar for a lot of communities, unfortunately. There are challenges around different parts of Wales in terms of forecasting, obviously a lot of upland areas. We do see that enhancing the rainfall. There was a large rainfall event in Burt, but it's not an automatic link then to issuing flood warnings directly. It is a balance of, as Jeremy's describing, those assessments taking place and looking at what the flood models are saying. And we do have around 2,000 at least local flood models across England and Wales. They all need maintaining and updating as catchments continue to change and as the climate changes. So in keeping up with that changing risk, there's a big asset maintenance activity, if you like, to sort of keep on top of that risk and then help communicate. And we don't communicate directly with the public, but we do through partner organisations and the parent organisations.
Thank you. And Mr Parr, back to Mr Parr again. How do Welsh flood defences compare with the rest of the UK, in your opinion?
We have an extensive network of flood defences across the whole of Wales, and they do their job in defending a lot of communities. Natural Resources Wales, for example, has 500 kilometres of defence. It's comparable in terms of the systems that are used in Wales and the systems which are used in England in terms of design of those flood defences. But of course, we're answerable to Welsh Government and to the Senedd in terms of their investment priorities and their investment needs. There is generally a good level of protection to the highest risk communities across Wales, but it is extremely challenging circumstances that we're dealing with in terms of climate change and more extreme weather and rapid response of river networks.
Great, thank you very much.
Enos Mehdi, please.
Can I just come in on that, Mr. Powers? Just the flood defence, there are schemes in place, but there's match funding by local governments for them to be approved. And are you seeing them becoming more challenging as the budgets in local governments is tightening? And also the model around and to the criteria for those flood defence funding actually is the impact on houses, but yet I have an example in my constituency where a village could be cut off and has been cut off, but because there's no direct impact on houses, they're never eligible for the funding. Do you think that there's need a relook actually on how the criteria for the funding for the flood defences?
So I think if I sort of break down the answer to that in terms of there are different authorities with different responsibilities for flood risk management in Wales, just as they are in the rest of the UK. NRW, Natural Resources Wales, has responsibility when it comes to main river, which is generally the larger watercourses in the sea, and local authorities have the responsibilities when it comes to smaller watercourses and local watercourses and drainage, and the water companies indeed have responsibilities for drainage as well. And they are funded in sort of slightly different ways. So Natural Resources Wales, for example, gets all of its money from Welsh Government, and there is no match funding as such for NRW because all and get partnership contributions where we can. The match funding point is a point, as you say, for local authorities, where traditionally, historically, they have had to put match funding forward for schemes. Welsh Government keep that under review, and I think, indeed, recently the rules on that might have changed such that the levels of match funding are more relaxed. I think I would have to double-check that, but it is something that Welsh Government continually sort of keep in review. I think other elements of your question, I think perhaps around the levels of investment and the standards. And
I have a village called Llangor.
Oh, yeah.
It was cut off when the flooding happens.
Yes.
But the route that needs the flood defence, because there's no houses affected,
Right. Yeah.
they don't fit the criteria for any funding. But though there's a residential and a nursing
Yes.
home and everything in this village, and we couldn't get the emergency service, it doesn't reach the criteria.
Right,
and
yes.
do you think that the criteria is accurate to safeguard communities?
Yes, so we have to follow, Treasury standards, Green Book standards in terms of the levels of investment and what we invest in. We also have to follow Welsh Government's policy directive and strategic directive, which is about risk to life and flooding around properties. However, it's not just about properties. I mean, a point's been made around livelihoods and infrastructure and as you say, roads and different elements of things which are at risk, which can put communities at risk. So we will take all of those things into account, but it's true to say that the priority does go to homes and to properties when everything needs to be looked at on a risk basis across the whole of Wales.
Yeah, thank you.
Enos, you want to carry on? All right.
Yeah, so it's funding again. Do you think that the current funding model that the NRW have is sufficient enough to deal with the challenge that NRW faces in flooding?
It's probably true to say, like all government-sponsored organisations, that we fully utilise the money that we get, and of course we would like more money to do more. I think the challenge is clearly there in terms of both the climate emergency and the nature emergency and the scale of the challenge going forward. We have, for example, earlier this year published figures, a report, our long-term investment requirements report for flood defences in Wales, which said over a 100-year time period we need 3.4 times as much money as at present for looking after the flood defences and the maintenance of the flood defences, and that report's publicly available on our website, for example. But it's important, it's really important that it's not just capital funding for flood defences. It will always rain, there will always be floods. We can't stop everything from happening all of the time. So the whole elements of what we've been talking about today about flood forecasting, flood warning, community engagement, all of those sorts of things are revenue funded, and it's really important that our revenue budgets again keep pace with the challenge and the climate change and nature emergency challenges.
Yeah.
David Chadwick, please.
Thank you, Chair. There are 2,573 disused coal tips across Wales, and 360 of them have been deemed high risk. So this is a question for Jeremy. How will the £25 million allocated in the UK budget help to deal with the coal tip spills caused by floods, particularly given that the total cost of remediating these tips has been put down as 600 million?
It is an incredible challenge for Wales with that industrial legacy and the number of coal tips that are across Wales, as you say, more than 2,500. The sort of policy and strategy on this, again, is led by Welsh Government. You know, NRW is a partner within that. Our role within that, our estate on our land, over 140 on our land across Wales. So after the awful Tylerstown incident in 2020, a lot of effort was put into this by Welsh Government, setting up a task force and a working group. There's been revision of the legislation and the recent publication of the renewed legislation in Wales. It's really important that the inspection regimes are undertaken, so that whole process of categorising the coal tips, prioritising where the inspections take place, working with the Coal Remediation Authority and the local authorities on that, is hugely important, because as we saw again in the recent storms, come Tulare, there was a slip there as well. So clearly the risk is there. But NRW role within that is not the lead organisation. It is as a partner at the table to look at the risks on our coal. Well, I say the coal tips legacy on our estate.
You mentioned prioritisation. How would you prioritise those 360 high-risk tips?
So that's prioritised on a national basis and put into different categories, and again led by Welsh Government in terms of that risk classification, and I believe previously by the Coal Authority, which is now the Mines Remediation Authority. So it was very much led by them in terms of the risks with those sites. And again, NRW uses that risk information to prioritise the work that we do.
Thank you. And these tips are causing continued disruption to communities across Wales. For example, in Godrewdraig, the children are going to school in temporary accommodation, essentially because their school had to be closed because of the threat from a nearby coal tip. So how long do you think it will take to acquire the necessary people, equipment and skills to adequately deal with the coal tips?
I think, as you outlined there in terms of some of the figures you quote, and that figure of £600 million is the sort of number that may be needed. Obviously, there is a significant challenge there over a time period. So it is important that the risks are prioritised, and they are dealt with on a prioritised basis. I think it's not just the landslips as well, and members may remember the event in Skewin in Swansea, where there was a sudden release of water to a community there from an old working mine shaft, and indeed metal mines as well, and the impacts from metal mines. So I think this whole industrial legacy and the consequences of the industrial legacy is a significant issue for Welsh Government. And I know on speaking to Welsh Government colleagues that they're keen, obviously, that UK Government plays its part in terms of recognising the risks and helping address those risks as well.
Anne Davis, please.
Thank you. Before I go on to my proper question, I just want to pick up on something the three of you have mentioned, actually, is the 5 years of weather we've had, which has resulted in continuous flooding over the winter period, to be honest. I've one village in my constituency in Pontargothi, which continuously floods. Only 7 properties are affected, but it's 3-4 times every winter. And, I just don't understand why we can't look at the rivers and clean the rivers in order to get the water flowing down. Farmland, nobody minds that farmland floods, but when it continuously affects 5 or 6 properties, 7 properties every year, every winter, then surely we need to look at our rivers, get them cleaned, get them dredged in these hot spots that we all have within our communities. And I just wonder, very briefly, if you're willing, Mr. Parr, what your thoughts are on that.
I think there's a point there, isn't there, around flooding being a natural phenomenon, and the need for floods to go into floodplains, as you say, and that's naturally what would happen. So I think the idea of being able to contain all water in a river channel and convey it out to sea is not a sort of correct premise, because in order to do that you would need to build higher and higher defences as you go down river systems until you go out to sea. I think that used to be, sort of years ago, the main mantra about conveying water downstream faster. But if you're not careful, you are conveying that flood risk to communities downstream by doing so. So what's important is all of these things are done. We do dredge rivers, we do remove shoal from rivers in locations. It has some impact, but it doesn't have as big an impact as most people think, because when you get such quantities of water, even with a little bit extra capacity in channels, it will come out of those channels and it will flood areas. I think what's really important, and particularly as we look to the future, is that we really engineer locations that we allow to flood, along the lines of what you're saying. So, sacrificial land in certain areas to allow to flood so that communities don't flood downstream, for example. And again, that's not particularly easy, is it, in terms of that land is under ownership by somebody, what's the value of the land. But when we're dealing with such huge quantities of water, I remember very briefly, I remember in Storm Dennis, it was 800 cubic metres per second, which was coming down the river, and that's enough water to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 3 seconds, continuously coming. It's huge quantities of water. So we do need to use all the levers at our disposal, working across all organisations to work out how to really look after such huge quantities of water in catchments. And things like sustainable farming scheme in Wales, will have its place in terms of how land is used. We all need to work together.
Move on, we'll have a conversation again, perhaps.
Sure.
But anyway, so how do you utilise the information, really, that you receive from the Met Office and the National Flood Forecasting Centre for your flood warnings? So this is specifically about the flood warnings.
Yes, I explained this a little bit earlier, so I'll sort of recap and be a bit brief on it in the interest of time, perhaps, but we can go into more detail. So we work closely with the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre. In essence, I think it's best to think about it as the Met Office looks at the weather, and what's going to happen in terms of the weather and what's going to happen in terms of rainfall in particular. That information, is then utilised by the Flood Forecasting Centre, and we work closely with the Flood Forecasting Centre to work out what that will mean in terms of flooding on a big scale. Flood Forecasting Centre operate on an England and Wales basis, really on a county sort of level basis, if you like. Then we take that information within NRW in terms of the predictions of where that rainfall is going to hit to put into models. We don't have models for everywhere, and this is one of the things that we would like to do more of in the future, for example. But where we have models, we put that information into models to predict what's going to happen with rivers. But it is quite a complicated picture. It's the amount of rain which is falling, how wet the catchment already is, where in the catchment the rain is going to fall, and you may have several rivers, with different amounts of rainfall hitting them, for example. But we take that information to predict where we'll flood, and where we think flooding will happen, we issue flood warnings, and where we think flooding is possible, before that we will issue flood alerts. So again, back to Storms Bert and Darragh, we were issuing flood alerts for many parts of Wales during those days leading up to the events, and then flood warnings when we were more certain.
What you're saying, it doesn't matter that the agencies in Exeter, whatever that information comes is relevant, and you tweak that for Wales then with NRW.
That's correct, and that's been the working relationship for many years. Many years.
So, do the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre provide you with all the data that you need, or do you feel that, or does Natural Resources Wales also, so you also monitor the flood risk separately then from the data that you get from the Met Office?
So we have a network of river gauges and rain gauges, and some of those rain gauges feed into the Met Office system and are utilised by the Met Office. But in essence, we take that data and then we put that data through our models. I think the increasing challenge is the rapid, extreme rainfall events, really intense rainfall events, particularly if we get them in steep-sided, rapidly responding catchments, and then that time period from knowing that is going to happen, issuing the warnings and getting that information out often can be quite a compressed time frame because just of the speed at which it can happen. So I think the improvements in the future, that's one of the things, that accuracy of the exact rainfall predictions and where they're going to be, and that's something that we work with colleagues Simon and Russ in the Met Office and the Flood Forecasting Centre.
One very brief question, Chair, about soil. So how do you get your soil analyses then? Where do you get that? That doesn't come from your weather vane. So how do you know how wet the land is to absorb or any further rainfall? Or whoever wants to answer that.
Well, we have hydrological information, and we have information about the state of the catchments and we know how much rainfall has hit the catchments in the recent preceding weeks. I don't know whether Russ wants to add to this.
Yeah, we pull all that information together, so we've got it across England and Wales. So obviously we've got a lot of shared catchments as well. So there's really good data exchange. There's a fantastic network of rain gauges and river level stations. We've got access to all of that across England and Wales. That drives, with the Met Office data, the national models, but also when we coordinate what goes into the local models as well to support decision making. There's the centre in Cardiff for Wales. There are 7 local centres in England as well, and we coordinate the activity across each of those, but they're through the parent organisations.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Anne. Ben Lake, please.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming this morning. I would like to turn more to how you share information with responders during a storm event. And with Storm Dara, we've got a very recent example of how the high winds, the incredibly strong high winds, cause significant impact not only to people's lives and property, but also to key infrastructure. And one of the concerns that's been raised with me in sort of representing an area in West Wales is that when the mobile network is knocked out because of a lack of power or damage to the actual site themselves, there's this question of how we maintain communication between not just emergency services but also communicating alerts or updated advice to people. And so my first question, Mr. Parr, if I may, was that a concern or an issue that you encountered during Storm Dara in terms of communicating to residents, civilians, but also emergency services? And then second question, you did mention the river gauges and the rain gauges that you have, and as a keen observer myself during these events, I know the website's very good in terms of giving you a level of information about the river. Does the reporting or the sharing of that data depend on mobile networks, or is there some other sort of network that is used to collect that data? If I could start with Mr. Parr.
Sure. So your first question around organisations working together and making sure messages go out and messages go to the public in such circumstances, I think the starting point for that is that there is a network of emergency responders and people who respond during floods. It's through the Civil Contingencies Act responsibilities primarily, and it's through things called local resilience forums, and they're organised around the police authorities. They have the police, they have the emergency services, they have the local authorities, they have NRW, and they have health boards, for example, and also water companies and Met Offices are also part of that structure as well. It's really important to reflect on those for a moment, because they work, if you like, in peace times to make sure that the guidance is there, the procedures are there, the plans are there, the contacts, because some of the times, this is helped, isn't it, by knowing people and personal contacts as well. But making sure all of those things are in place and exercised such that when it is needed, we're confident that it is going to work. And so that kicked in, during these events. We were sharing information, for example, through that network to say, this is what we're looking at, this is what we're expecting to happen. So that information is going to what we tend to call those partner organisations to say, heads up, something may happen here, and the level of confidence associated with it. So, for example, during Storm Dara, largely on the back of the red weather warning, that whole system kicked in. There were strategic commands and tactical command groups set up, which is, again, some of the terminology associated with it. But what that means is those organisations coming together through telecoms and with the ability to meet in person if needed, if comms went down, for example, to do the thinking and do the preparation and get those messages out and get the preparations running. And that happened all the way through Storm Dara, for example, and happened all the way through that. I think in terms of loss of power, I think, again, it's sort of business continuity planning in a way, isn't it, in terms of thinking about what if you were to lose power. I live in Wales, work in Wales, and I was well aware that there were large parts of Wales which did have power cuts during that time, particularly sort of the more western areas, not exclusively so, but more. And indeed, we had some of our staff who were out of contact for those reasons as well. And it's important that we have contingencies in place and backups and people that we can turn to. Quite a lot of our message to the public does depend on website, does depend on mobile coverage, does depend on all those sorts of things. So I think, again, ultimately it's important that people have things like radios with batteries in it, for example, to get the latest information and the latest news. And again, I think that's something I was referring to before, just thinking through, that kind of what if, and if it were to happen, where would I get the information from, what may I need? So I think, again, there's a real job of work, I think, to do, working with communities to say we have to face these possibilities and prepare ourselves as best we can for these possibilities.
And then just in terms of some of the river gauges and the stations themselves, in terms of getting the real-time data from those sites, does it depend on the mobile network, or is it another...
It does depend on the mobile network, and there are degrees of sort of contingency with that and backup with that in terms of backup power, backup generation. But most of those do depend on mobile network to get the message back through the telemetry system from the field to the base. And we are...
Of course, it also depends, the end user, as it were, receiving the information. In this case, will also need the network. But it's interesting, because I think the Storm Dara just perhaps highlighted the value of looking again at some of the mast sites in more rural areas, exposed areas, to see if we do have ways of getting them back online quicker during that.
But as you say, river levels information on our website, I think, is hugely useful information for people, and pleased to say, that stood up largely through these events, that there was good real-time information on those river levels.
You got the right answer? Yeah, thanks.
Andrew Ranger, please.
Thank you. To Mr Turner, if I may, for this one. So as an agency that is funded by both the UK and Welsh governments, how do you cooperate with Natural Resources Wales and local authorities in Wales?
Okay, we have a really close working relationship. We produce, if we go through a sort of cycle, a lot of seasonal briefings specific to Wales, specific support for NRW to deliver. We have a lot of, there have been Welsh Government visits and NRW visits last year down to the centre as well. So there's a good day-to-day kind of working relationship. We provide, as I say, coverage for England and Wales, and whilst there are technical differences about how the services are provided, because both England and Wales have two different flood forecasting systems, we are able to work through that and make sure that the assessment is done on a robust and similar basis as well. That's supported through common working with local resilience forums, training material, exercise material, both for coastal events and river inland events as well. So there's a whole range of support that's available and specific to Wales, I'd add as well. So we work very closely on a range of levels.
Great. And just as a supplementary for me, very quickly, the relationship with local authorities, is that good across the board, or is it variable across Wales?
We would mostly work through the Environment Agency teams or Natural Resources Wales teams. We would attend and support meetings where we needed to there. Obviously, we're a small team, we can't go to all of the local authority meetings, but we would work through NRW. I think, a particular strong point is on training and exercising in advance of events and having bespoke products that are produced that responders can, train with and practice. Those are available. But then there is a good join up with, particularly our flood guidance statement, which does go across England and Wales, because that does support cross-border working and, more widely joint working.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Lily, did you want to come in there?
Yes, please. Yes, it was mentioned earlier, but just as a general principle, who is responsible for rivers? Is it Natural Resources Wales or local authorities?
Generally, NRW is responsible for rivers, but there is a distinction. It is main rivers that we're responsible for, and that is an historic term. It generally means the bigger rivers, and it generally means the smaller water courses are the responsibility of the local authorities. But you can't just say it's all big rivers. But generally that's the case. NRW for the larger rivers and for the coastal flooding, and local authorities for smaller water courses and drainage.
Thank you.
Rembrandt, please.
Thank you. Just continuing on this theme of information sharing, Simon, I wonder if you could just let us know, during a flooding event, obviously besides the colour of the weather warning, does the Met Office pass on any other information to the devolved Welsh agencies? And what's the process for any kind of real-time updates that might be coming through as data is evolving?
So if I take Bert as an example, we issued weather warnings on Wednesday the 20th of November. We are Cat 2 responder under the Civil Contingency Act, and part of that, we discharge that duty through 22 civil contingency advisors who are spread across the UK. The Civil Contingency Advisor in Wales started a series of calls, firstly into both into NRW and also, just as an example, like the head of Cardiff Emergency Planning. It's like one type of example of a call. And then Friday we were talking to Welsh Government and sending a briefing out into the Deputy First Minister, and throughout from Wednesday right through to Sunday, regular emails with the local resilience forums about this is the situation with the weather, this is the rainfall we are expecting, tying in the messages around significant flooding but low likelihood localised flooding. So that was the consistent message through that event. We also attended a pre-event telephone call which was set up by North Wales, where all local resilience forums attended on the Friday. So we will tie into any tactical or strategic coordination group, and the pre-event calls are all set up by the local resilience forum. So that's generally how we work during an event. So constant feed of information. From a weather warning perspective, that is constantly updating. If times change or impacts change, our teams go through a regular assessment. My teams are 24/7, so it doesn't matter whether it's day or night. Naturally, we tend to issue more warnings in the day because that's when the public are going to have their phones on. That's the best time to get the message out in terms of media partners, etc. And then how we communicate weather warnings from a public perspective. That's through our web and app, and that's pretty much updated in real time once my teams push the button if there's a change. We also have a public weather media service, of which do ITV, Channel 5, Sky. They take data and advice from us, and we also provide our National Severe Weather Warning service to the likes of BBC and S4C.
Sounds like there's quite a lot of different ways of communicating, and obviously it sounds like the Met Office are trying to feed in regularly with various devolved agencies. I just wonder whether you had any thoughts on whether that process could or should be streamlined or improved in any way.
So if you go back to Storm Bert, having met with the resilience community, with the Welsh Government a couple of weeks ago, feel they were well prepared, they understood the narrative. The more and more steps you have in the way, from weather warnings to flood warnings, then to resilience response, then to community response, there'll always be areas you can improve within that process. And particularly with climate change, it's really, really important that process is streamlined, as efficient as it can be. You can always make improvements, is my response. So any particular learning from Bert, I think the colour of the weather warning has been challenged, and we will certainly reflect on that. But I think we have a well-oiled local resilience forum machine. We talked about there's regular exercising, we have a stakeholder user group with partners meet, there's a UK flooding leadership group. That community joins together really well. And I think the bit I point to, the National Resilience Strategy, just talk about how to improve the resilience of the UK overall. I think it's those recommendations as the UK we should take forward.
Thank you.
Witherden, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about mitigating future flood risk, and I'd like to hear from all of the panel, please. So climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of flooding events. In my constituency, we see it on the Montgomery to Welshpool Road and in other hotspots all around the constituency. I'm very curious to know, what do you think needs to be done to ensure that flood warnings, and even more so us defences in Wales, adapt to the growing changes presented by climate change?
Maybe if I kick us off in terms of from an NRW perspective, I think it's apparent, and I think we've talked today about the the rising challenge, both from the climate emergency and the nature emergency, and the need for a response around on both fronts. And I think it's not as easy as there is one answer to this. There is one thing that we need to do. I think there's a range of things that we need to do to manage those risks. And I think it is about managing the risks. We can't stop all rainfall, and we can't, unfortunately, stop all flooding. So it is about investing in flood defences, and they're going to continue to be a really important part of the response and the management response. But it's also all of the other things as well. It's thinking about planning decisions and where we put people in the first place, and making sure we don't put more people at flood risk through planning decisions. It's about sharing that information about flood risk and working with communities to understand what that risk means and how to respond to it. I think the warnings is obviously very much part of that picture, but I think a warnings is only as good as what happens when on receipt of that warning. What is it that we're expecting people to do? What is it that we're expecting partner organisations to do? I think one of the things also we've talked about today is we are going to have to look at how we manage whole catchments and all organisations working together. We talked briefly there about NRW, main rivers and local authority, non-main rivers and ordinary watercourses and smaller. But of course they flow into each other. We need to work together on this issue, and the water companies as well, and look at catchments as a whole. And I think really the future is about building in resilience, so bounce back ability, in terms of properties. It's about adaptation, recognising that there are risks and we need to do something about it. And I think increasingly it's going to be thinking about how do we manage these huge quantities of water. It's got to go somewhere, and it's really better that it goes to locations where it's going to have less of an impact.
Thank you, Mr. Bugg. We go to Mr. Turner next.
Yeah, thank you. I think for us, the challenges on flood forecasting technically, we know a lot of the solutions for that. I think the challenge is actually keeping pace with those and being able to deploy them. So, as an example, if there is good practice in Scotland, can Wales take advantage of that? Can we share that good practice round? That is actually quite challenging. As organisations work separately and procure and put in systems separately, and the contracts and the license, all of those business things are actually quite a challenge in terms of good join up and working, and we see quite a lot of that as a joint partnership ourselves. So I'd emphasise that keeping pace with the technical development is part of the challenge, but actually how we get those out across the UK, if that's what we want to do, is something that organisations can look at, to improve and streamline, to make sure we can continue to keep pace, because we want to make sure that responders and LRFs have the best information available. And the barrier might not be technically, it might be on actually how organisations operate and communicate and share that.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown.
So I'd follow up on Russ's point. So Met Office provides a UK-wide remit, and flooding is devolved, and ensuring more consistency, standardisation, hydrometeorology is becoming a sacred resource. So there's work to do across the UK around to bring that skill set through academia and then into organisations such as ourselves. The other thing we're focusing on as well within the Met Office is much more around social science. So this is not just about the meteorology, this is about how we communicate our messaging, and actually meteorologists in particular being almost social sciences and understanding human behaviour. So we've got a whole different skill set and we're trying to develop within the organisation. I just wanted to follow up something Jeremy said. In terms of getting flood warnings out, one of the things we are looking to do next year is bring flood warnings into our public weather media service. That will allow broadcasters not just to communicate weather warnings, but also to include flood warnings. That's going to be tricky because broadcasters typically have 15 seconds to about a minute to describe the weather. But we will be working through our public weather service to work with broadcasters to both help communicate weather warnings and support our partners in terms of flood warnings. You've picked up the point about climate change. We did an actual recent survey on the 23-24 storm season, and that showed 20% more rainfall typically associated with those storms. We're seeing more days over 50 mils. Like Jeremy said earlier, climate change is absolutely happening, and properties, we're not going to be able to protect everyone. There's a significant amount of investment, and there are some choices to be made.
And I suppose, in conclusion, obviously the knowledge you've expressed to us this morning is great, and what you have in front of you, have expert accountability here, if you like. But my question is, how do we get your knowledge to the public? Because you're talking about climate change very matter-of-factly. A lot of people, the general public, are still coming to terms with the effects of climate change. So I'm just wondering, in a sentence, how would you actually get to make sure the public become better informed on climate change and the dangers of flooding across Wales? If I start with Mr Turner. One sentence.
One sentence. I think people really understand the risk, and I think it's really recognising that you do need to, be involved in the process as we are, really, to be able to deal with this on a changing basis, I think. So it's really to get involved in that, in the whole area, I think, really.
Mr Brown.
Two very quick points, Chair. One is around tackling climate misinformation, and we've been working with Welsh Government through Climate Action Week and really targeting young people, because young people will be talking to their parents about climate misinformation. The other point I'd make is risk perception. Risk perception of the public isn't just about weather, it isn't just about flooding, it's about other risks we carry in society, and that's absolutely reflected in the National Resilience Strategy, and a public understanding of risk perception is going to be key to this.
Thank you. Mr Parr.
I think I could add just a couple of quick things to that. I think one is education and making sure that from a young age, people are, it's part of the curriculum, it's there. We do work with the curriculum in Wales to that extent. It's like recycling in a way, isn't it? You can change people's perceptions. I think the other thing I would reflect on is what we've talked about today, about working with communities, about both the risk now and the risk in the future, and what we collectively, communities and organisations, can do about it. There's certain things we could do, and there's certain things we won't be able to do, and I think having the honesty of those discussions, I think, is hugely important.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all panel members. I thank Ms Russell Turner, Simon Brown and Jeremy Parr for coming before us this morning to discuss flooding in Wales. And I now call the session to close. Order.